Bibliophiles of the internet, we are getting closer to Pride Month, which means it's almost time for the 17th round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, and I have recommendations for what you can read to fit pretty much every prompt. Even if you're not taking part in the read-a-thon, these are a bunch of queer books that you can check out any time of year that you would like. And also, if you want to learn more about the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, how it works, all the details, I will have Kathy's announcement video linked down below for your convenience. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right in with the first prompt of the bingo board, which is a spec. This is pretty self-explanatory. It applies to any book where the main character or characters fall on the asexual spectrum. My first recommendation actually features a main character who is aro ace, and that is Shapes of Love by Elvi Peñalba. This is a recently released YA book about a 19-year-old pop star named Sasha whose first album has been mega successful. But as her fandom continues to grow, people become increasingly obsessed with figuring out who inspires all her love songs. What they don't know is that she's actually aro ace, and she doesn't write songs about romantic love or relationships, but rather based on her own favorite bookish manga and anime fandoms and ships. One day she runs into her strange best friend, Kai, and while the two of them are catching up with each other, they're photographed together and those photos are leaked to the press. And naturally, everyone assumes that this is the mysterious boyfriend who broke Sasha's heart. So to save face, Kai and Sasha agree to do a PR relationship for 6 months, which will actually give them time to repair their platonic friendship in the process. I read this fairly recently and I thought it was a really good time. It's a fun twist on a pop star romance or fake dating romance without actually involving any romance. And I found it to be a fairly nuanced portrayal of what it means to be an aro ace person in a world that is not built for people who aren't in partnerships or romantic relationships. Plus, this could also count for the rainbow cover prompt because it has the colors of the sunset aro ace flag in the heart. I haven't read this next book myself, but I know it comes highly recommended. That would be the anthology Being Ace, edited by Madeline Dyer. Like I said, this is an anthology described as being a collection of stories that explore the infinite realms of asexual love across sci-fi, fantasy, and contemporary settings. I wanted to mention this one because I think it's a really cool project and a great way to quickly discover a bunch of new and exciting ace voices, but also because a companion anthology recently came out which is called Being Aro, and even though that one doesn't fulfill this specific prompt, they're both really cool and they'd also both work for the rainbow cover space. The next prompt is much more subjective. It's called See Yourself, and it's basically for any book where the characters share an identity, label, or experience that you also share. So for obvious reasons, I can only share books that overlap with my own experiences. First, I want to show some love for It Sounds Like This by Ana Meridiano. This is a nerdy YA coming-of-age story about a teenager named Yasmin who just wants to get off on the right foot as she starts her first year of marching band. But she drastically missteps when she reports an anonymous gossip Instagram account harassing new band members and accidentally gets the entire low brass section suspended from all after-school activities in the process. So in order to atone, she decides to switch out of the flute section and teach herself how to play tuba, landing herself with a gaggle of rowdy freshman boys who are just as new to marching band and playing low brass as she is. I love this book so much. It made me feel seen in more ways than one. It's not only about a young Latina kid in marching band, but the main character plays flute like me. She's juggling Catholic confirmation classes with band practice like I did, and she's also aro ace questioning like I was, even though I didn't realize it at the time. The love interest Bloom is also demi-romantic and demisexual, which are also labels that I use for myself. And for all those reasons, this book could also count towards the beyond LGBT space. I'm also going to once again wholeheartedly recommend Beating Heart Baby by Leo Min. This is a blisteringly tender YA coming-of-age story about a young mixed-race Filipino boy named Santi who just transferred schools and is also joining the marching band where everyone is super excited to have him. Everyone except for a haughty trans trumpet player named Suwa who's convinced that Santi does not have what it takes. Besides being just one of the most beautiful, soul-searing, moving stories I've ever read, hands down, there's once again a lot of overlap between myself and these characters. One of them is Transmask, they're both queer, they're both BIPOC characters, and they're both obsessed with music, so if any of that applies to you, I definitely recommend it for this space. The next prompt is rainbow cover, which means queer books that have the rainbow integrated into the cover design or that have color schemes that are reminiscent of any of the pride flags. And the first one I thought of was Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant by Curtis Chin. This is actually a memoir from Curtis Chin, a Chinese-American filmmaker and activist who grew up in his parents' Chinese restaurant in 1980s Detroit. The book basically explores what it was like for him to grow up working in that restaurant and how that unique cultural environment shaped his understanding of his queerness, his Asian identity, and his path in life. While this memoir isn't necessarily bringing anything new to the table in terms of autobiography, it is structured in a really interesting way, in a way that imitates the sections of a menu, with each dish or chapter growing more and more substantial as the sections progress. Definitely an interesting read, and one that would also count towards the nonfiction space. I'm also going to go a bit outside the box here and say that Monstrilio by Gerardo Samana Cordova would also fit this prompt. This is a Latine horror story about a grieving mother named Magos, whose young son has just tragically passed away, and instead of accepting that loss, she cuts out a piece of his decaying lung and miraculously nurtures him back to life. But the creature that grows from that piece of lung is clearly not human, and even though over time he begins to resemble her son Santiago more and more, he has these violently gruesome tendencies that, if not controlled, could very well destroy his fragile second chance at life. This is definitely a queer book because pretty much no one in it is straight, but besides that, it's a truly masterful, extraordinary piece of fiction that is a powerful meditation on grief and an interrogation of how far we as humans are willing to go to avoid sitting with our own pain. It's really fantastic. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet, and it would also arguably work for the creepy queer space. Then we have the free space, which of course is up for interpretation. There are so many different possibilities and directions you could take with this space. I can't really help you choose a prompt, but I can share a few ideas. You could read a book that's been on your TBR for more than 5 years. You could read from your favorite genre, from outside your comfort zone, a book written in a non-traditional format, a translated book. You could read the last book you bought or borrowed. You could read a book outside your age range. You could read a book that's intersectional or exploring multiply marginalized characters. Again, it's really your choice. The next prompt is Femme Over 40, and for that one, I would firstly recommend The Seep by Shauna Porter. This is a sci-fi alien invasion story following a trans woman named Trina, whose life is forever changed when an alien entity calling itself the Seep slowly and gently takes over the entire world. Capitalism falls, hierarchies are broken down, and with the new technology brought by this alien race, anything that can be imagined can now become true. Trina's wife is happy to live under the influence of the Seep, and she actually decides that she wants to be reborn as an infant, and so she leaves Trina behind to move on to a new life and a new existence. So the story is about Trina grappling with the grief of losing her wife in that really unexpected way, and she also runs into a mysterious young boy who leads her on a very strange quest. I read this a couple of years ago, and I thought it was a really fascinating take on the concept of an alien invasion. I think it's taking a lot of interesting narrative risks as well, which is why I would definitely recommend it. This next book I haven't read myself, but it sounds really interesting. It's called Meridian by Grace Flahive. This is actually set in a Florida retirement resort for queer women in the year 2067. The main character, Hannah, has spent 10 happy years living her best life at this resort, but she has received a terminal cancer diagnosis and has decided that she's ready to pass on. But before she does, all of her friends are throwing her this huge party to celebrate her life. And on the guest list is Sophie, the love of Hannah's life, who she hasn't spoken to since they broke up over 40 years ago. But she's hoping that before she dies, they can somehow get a second chance. Again, I haven't read this one myself, so I can't vouch for quality, but we don't often get stories centering queer elders like this, so for that reason, I think it's at least worth checking out. Next is the retelling space, and of course, this is for any books that retell or reimagine established or popular stories. First up, I definitely have to once again recommend This Wretched Beauty by Elle Grenier. This is part of Macmillan's Remix Classic series. It's a queer and trans retelling of The Picture of Dorian Gray, following a trans femme non-binary Dorian who is the sole heir to a title and their family's estate. But in order to inherit that estate, they've been trapped living with their manipulative grandfather who has very strict ideas about their path and their life. But when Dorian meets a young, talented painter named Basil who insists on painting their portrait, they're introduced to a new side of London that they've never seen before and a whole new world of possibilities. This is easily one of my favorite books I've read so far this year. It's a beautifully written reimagining of Dorian Gray that not only honors the inherent queerness and horror of the original story, but also takes it even further than Oscar Wilde could have ever imagined. It's a really powerful homage to his groundbreaking work, and of course, if you know anything about the original story, you won't be surprised to hear that this could also fit for the messy queers prompt. This is also my biannual opportunity to once again plug Peter Darling by S.A. Chant. This is a self-published reimagining of Peter Pan, where Peter was once known as Wendy Darling and lived in the human world until he realized he was trans. At that point, he escaped into Neverland, but eventually he began to miss his family and decided to return to the human world, even if it meant living as Wendy again. But eventually he realizes that he can no longer live as that person, so he goes back to Neverland, but he returns to find that Neverland and everyone in it has drastically changed in his absence. There's really nothing about this I can say that I haven't said before. I read this for the first time in 2018, and genuinely I have not stopped thinking about it ever since. I believe this to be one of the most formative trans books of an entire generation, and if you have not read it yet, I think you really should. And because Peter escapes from the human world to Neverland, I think you could also make an argument for this book fitting into the escape space. Then we have the shorter than a novel space, which again is pretty self-explanatory. This is any kind of short form work. It can be a comic, a graphic novel, a short story, a novella, a poetry collection. So first, I would recommend both novellas in the Monk and Robot duology by Becky Chambers. This is a cozy sci-fi story about a traveling non-binary teen monk known as Sibling Dex, who basically listens to other people's troubles and worries and brews them the perfect cup of tea as a sort of remedy for those problems. As they're going about their travels, they run into a robot, which is notable because many years ago when robots gained sentience, they completely extracted themselves from the human world and decided to live separately. But now this robot has returned, and its mission is to answer the question of what it is that humans need most. I think this is a really lovely, comforting, restorative series. It's all about how slowness and softness are essential parts of life, but only a small part of what ultimately makes up a meaningful life. And the audiobooks, which are read by M. Grosland, are fantastic as well, so I would definitely recommend those. One of my other favorite queer novella series to recommend is the Mossa Pleiti series, and the first book is The Mimicking of Known Successes by Malka Older. This is a queer Latinx sci-fi series. It can also be described as a cozy Holmesian mystery series. It follows a prolific investigator named Mossa who solves crimes on Jupiter, where humankind has successfully established an outpost for itself. In this first book, a professor mysteriously goes missing on the very edge of this human outpost, and Mossa is forced to consult her ex, Pleiti, who works at the university, to help her crack the case. This is such a great series. All three books that have come out so far have been top-notch. The Sherlock-Watson dynamic between Mossa and Pleiti is so much fun to read, and each new book in the series takes a unique look at what humankind might become if we were to completely be removed from Earth, and I think it's a really interesting project. This next prompt is one of my favorites, and one that I could make entire full-length videos about, but that is queer sports, and I'm going to take this opportunity to once again wholeheartedly recommend The Other Olympians by Michael Waters. This is a really insightful, invaluable, informative history book that spotlights some lesser known and unknown trans athletes and Olympians from around the 1930s, and also the Olympic bureaucrats who saw those athletes as a threat and initiated forms of gender surveillance that still impact athletes today and dictate their ability to compete. Honestly, that's a very simplistic overview of this book. It's truly incredible, and I still think about it to this day, even though I read it almost 2 years ago at this point. If you care at all about trans people being able to play and compete in the sports they love, which you should, then this is an absolutely essential read in order to understand the predatory forms of gender surveillance that we're still very much contending with. Of course, I have to recommend a queer sports romance in this category as well, and selfishly, I'm going to take this chance to once again shout about an indie series that has absolutely stolen my heart because I need more people to talk about it with. I am, of course, referring to the Unwritten Rules series by Katie Casey. I'm going to focus on the first book, Unwritten Rules, which is a baseball romance about Zach Glasser, a hard-of-hearing Jewish catcher in the major leagues who was content to stay in the closet for the entirety of his career. But one fateful spring training season, he's introduced to his team's newest rookie catcher, Eugenio Morales. Zach becomes a sort of mentor to Eugenio, and as they begin to work more and more closely together, it's clear that they have a shared attraction to each other. But the story actually starts several years after that first season together when Zach and Eugenio are no longer on the same team and no longer speaking to each other. But they are unexpectedly reunited at the All-Star Classic. If you've seen my most recent monthly wrap-ups, you will find me gushing about the first 2 books in this companion trilogy. They're tender, they're thoughtful, they're deeply romantic, and the baseball elements are not just set dressing for the story. They're every bit as important and centered as the actual romance. If you enjoy queer sports stories or queer sports romances in any capacity, this series is a must. Next is another favorite category of mine. It's messy queers, which basically means stories about queer characters that are not neat and tidy. These characters fuck up, they make mistakes, maybe they're irredeemable, awful people, and that's okay. The first book I would recommend for this prompt is I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me by Jameson Shea. This is a queer YA horror story set in France about a ballet dancer named Laure who is constantly overlooked at the ballet academy she attends. So in order to level the playing field, one day she travels down to the catacombs, finds a river of blood, and pledges her soul to it in exchange for the power of undeniable influence. This is a dark, twisted, fucked up story about a deeply imperfect queer character who is power hungry and relentless in her never-ending search for success. this. Lore will do anything and hurt anyone if it means moving up in the ballet world. As a black queer girl in ballet, everyone around her already sees her as an anomaly or a monstrosity, and therefore she happily becomes the very monster that everyone believes her to be. This is the first book in a really great duology, and if you pick it up, it could also count for the creepy queer space. I would also recommend literally any book by Andrew Joseph White for this space, but I'm just going to spotlight his latest book, which was his adult debut called You Weren't Meant to Be Human. This is another disgusting, disturbing, deeply fucked up story from Andrew Joseph White. It's about an autistic trans man named Crane who doesn't speak by choice, and who also happens to have pledged his life to a species of alien worms in exchange for safety and the ability to live as himself. Unfortunately, Crane's asshole boyfriend accidentally gets him pregnant, and even though Crane does not want to have the child, the Hive insists that he carry the baby to term no matter what. This is a deeply visceral, horrific story that raises questions about bodily autonomy, agency, and the kinds of violence enacted on trans bodies each and every day. It's an absolutely wild, gruesome piece of fiction, but I would still happily recommend it. And of course, it would also work for the creepy queer space. Next, we have Beyond LGBT, meaning any queer stories with representation outside of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender identities. So the first book I would recommend is Darius the Great Is Not Okay by Adib Karam. This is a YA coming-of-age story about a Persian-American boy named Darius who feels very disconnected from his Iranian heritage. But regardless, he and his family are about to take a trip to Iran for him to meet his grandparents for the first and ostensibly also last time. And there he makes fast friends with his grandparents' neighbor, Sorab, who may very well change Darius's life. I purposefully included this book in this category because while Darius ultimately discovers his queer identity and has that a bit more solidified in the second book, in this first book, he's really questioning himself and his identity. And it's very rare for us to get meaningful, thoughtful, questioning rep like the kind we see in this book. I would also recommend Flawless Girls by A.M. McLemore. This is a blend of dark academia, horror, and surrealism. It's about two Latina sisters, Isla and Renata, whose grandmother wants them to become proper young ladies, and so she sends them to this exclusive finishing school known as Alari House. The younger sister, Isla, returns home within the first day, but Renata chooses to stay, and when she comes back to visit months later, Isla senses that something is different about her. She's pleasant, polite, perfect, but also possibly murderous. And after Renata suddenly disappears, Isla decides to re-enroll at Alari House and find out what they're really doing to their students. Among many other things, this book has on-the-page intersex rep, which we don't often get to see. And what's more, I think it's just a really unique and compelling take on the dark academia genre from a distinctly queer Latina lens. Our next category is folklore, and very appropriately I thought I would start off by suggesting Queer as Folklore, The Hidden Queer History of Myths and Monsters by Sasha Coward. This is a nonfiction book that's been on my own TBR for quite some time. It's a history book that explores the unsung heroes and villains of storytelling, fantasy, and magic, and each chapter investigates the queer history of different mythic and folkloric characters across centuries and continents. Personally, I love queer history, and I really appreciate any book that seeks to excavate and honor those histories and accounts. And I think this book is also exploring how these sparkly personas of fairies and unicorns that are often emblematic of queer expression are not just aesthetics, but rather queer symbols with deeply historic roots. I think the novella Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh would also work for this prompt. This novella is actually a retelling of a folktale known as The Green Man. The story follows a perfectly unremarkable man known as Tobias who lives a quiet life in Green Hollow Forest until one day he becomes the new owner of Green Hollow Hall, where all his darkest and closest kept secrets will finally come to light. I don't know much more beyond that, but this novella and its sequel have both been on my TBR for quite some time. And of course, because they are novellas, they would both work for the shorter than a novel space, and this first book at least would also work for the retelling space. The next prompt is escape, which is pretty open-ended. This can refer to books where the characters are literally escaping somewhere or someone. It could be an escapist story or a comforting story that allows you to escape from the world. My brain went to the darker route, and the first book that came to mind was Surrender Your Sons by Adam Sass. This is a dark YA thriller about a queer boy named Connor whose mom is deeply Christian, and after he tries to come out to her, she basically arranges for him to be kidnapped in the night and shipped off to a conversion therapy camp on a secluded island where he is going to continue to live until he decides to change. At the camp, he discovers that everyone is hiding their own dark secrets and that as long as they stay there, none of them are safe. So he decides to try and escape the island with his fellow campers, but not before he tries to find a way to burn down the entire place in his wake. This is a twisty, fast-paced, dread-inducing interesting story that is deeply uncomfortable and horrific in its realism when it comes to exploring the very real dangers of conversion therapy. But seeing Connor and his fellow campers fight their way through it is also incredibly cathartic. Within that same vein, I would also recommend Chlorine by Jade Song, which is a bit more of a stretch, but I think still works. This is another blend of horror, surrealism, and literary fiction about a young athlete named Ren, whose entire existence revolves around swimming. She knows if she swims well enough, she can get a scholarship, go to a good school, and make something great of her life. But Ren is so consumed by the water that she actually believes she's a mermaid who was transformed into a human, and so she becomes obsessed with finding a way to escape the human body she believes that she's been trapped in, no matter what anyone else thinks and no matter what it might cost. I would describe this story as being every bit as brutal as it is beautiful. The prose is stunning, the authorial vision is incredible, it's a truly unforgettable story about self-creation, about living with chronic pain, and about the simultaneous pain and beauty of transition in all its different forms. Moving on, next we have Creepy Queers, which I would argue both books in the previous category fit into as well. But this is basically for any queer horror books, queer books with dark and disturbing themes or plots. Personally, I would recommend What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is the first book in a series of horror novellas. They follow a retired non-binary soldier named Alex Easton, and this first book is actually a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. In this story, Alex receives word that a childhood friend named Madeline Usher has fallen into medical decline, and so Alex rushes to the crumbling Usher estate only to find a nightmare of fungal growths, possessed wildlife, a sleepwalking Madeline who speaks in tongues, and a mysterious lake that eerily pulses at night. This is another fantastic novella series that I would happily recommend any day of the week. Each of the novellas so far has explored a different genre of horror. The first one, as I said, is more of a retelling, the second book is folk horror, and the third book is more spatial horror, if that makes sense. T. Kingfisher is able to balance darkness and levity in a way that only she can really pull off, and because it's a novella series, any of them would count towards the shorter than a novel space, and at least this first book would count towards the retelling space. Another book I think absolutely fits this bill is Model Home by River Solomon. This is the author's deeply twisted take on a haunted house. It follows the three Maxwell siblings who were forced to grow up in a sinister house in a gated neighborhood where their family was the only black family around, and while their neighbors treated them politely and nicely, strange, horrific, and inexplicable things began happening to them in that house. As soon as they were old enough, all the siblings moved far away from that house, leaving their parents to live there alone, and it's not until they learn that their parents have both passed away that they're forced to return to the house and confront the horrors of their past. The main sibling in this story, Esri, is actually gender fluid, genderqueer, autistic, diabetic, and disabled, so there's a lot of intersectionality in that sense. And also I just think this is one of those books that wraps its hands around your throat from the opening sentence and does not let you go until the very last page. Then we have the nonfic space, which of course is for any nonfiction book, a memoir, a history book, an informational book, etc. I would love to take this time to once again recommend Paisley Kira's book, Sex Is As Sex Does. This is a blend of academic, legal, and political nonfiction written by a trans professor and researcher who co-founded the leading journal in transgender studies. In this book, the author is exploring the discrepancies of sex classification between different legal institutions such as the DMV, the court systems, the incarceration systems. The research here is mostly concerned with the function of sex classification and what kinds of tangible consequences that legal definitions of sex can hold according to these various state actors, as well as the implications for trans populations and other vulnerable populations. This is not a book that I can easily describe or distill into a couple of snappy sentences. It's complex, it's boundary breaking, it's expansive in its view of who sex classification impacts, and shows how these legal disparities exist to police, track, and surveil populations and influence the distribution of resources in a way that inherently furthers the capitalist and colonial project. Another nonfiction project I deeply respect and would also recommend is So Many Stars, an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color by Quero de Robertes. This is exactly what it says on the tin. The author traveled around the country collecting personal histories from BIPOC trans-spec individuals, asking them questions about self-discovery, identity, future-making, and so much more. I genuinely think that this is one of the most important, formative literary projects of our time. It's not often that we get to hear first-hand accounts of queer history from BIPOC trans folks, and there's something so special about the way this book is structured, not as narrative nonfiction, but as an oral history that really preserves and makes space for those voices. And at least in my opinion, I think this book would also work for the beyond LGBT space because it also includes two-spirit voices and also the rainbow cover space. The second to last prompt is alliteration, which basically means when a title has words that start with the same letter or that make similar sounds in close proximity to each other. For example, I would definitely recommend Murder by Memory by Olivia Waite. This is another cozy sci-fi mystery series set aboard a generation ship known as the HMS Fairweather, where the main character, Dorothy Gentleman, works as one of the ship's detectives. What's unique about this generation ship is that it allows its passengers to survive the long journey in space by preserving their memory in special library books. So if they happen to pass away on the journey, their memory can be injected into a new body and they can essentially come back to life. When the story starts, Dorothy's just woken up in a body that is decidedly not hers and that she also did not authorize. And to make things worse, she learns about a murder aboard the ship where the victim's memory book has also been destroyed in the process. I have thoroughly enjoyed both novellas in this series so far. There's a sense of moral urgency underpinning each of the mysteries, but even so, I would say both stories are relatively low stakes. But I also think Olivia Waite has some really interesting ideas about how society and social norms might change if more of our social needs were actually being met. And once again, because these are novellas, either book in the series would count for the shorter than a novel space. My second recommendation in this category would be a recent release called Opting Out by Maya Kobabe and Lucky Shrikumar. This is a middle grade comic about a young gender questioning kid named Sachi who's still getting used to junior high, especially when it seems like everyone around her, including her best friend, is suddenly changing and taking interest in things like dating, fashion, and gender roles. Sachi doesn't really want her body to change and often doesn't feel like either a girl or a boy, but rather something less defined in between. And the story is about her coming to terms with that idea and learning how to accept the fact that change is inevitable while also not losing hold of her true self. Not only would this book also count for the shorter than a novel space and the middle grade space, but I think it's also just a wonderful, thoughtful, sincere interrogation of growing up, going through puberty, navigating gender roles, and trying to figure out the difference between what's compulsory and what changes or choices we actually have agency over in our lives. And speaking of middle grade, the last prompt on the bingo board is the middle grade space. Middle grade is typically defined as any book written for an audience between the ages of 8 and 12. So my first recommendation would be It's All or Nothing Vale by Andrea Beatriz Arango. This is a really remarkable middle grade novel in verse about a young fencer named Vale who ends up getting injured and disabled in a car accident. After taking many months away from the sport to recover and rebuild her strength, she's finally cleared to get back into fencing, but she finds out that a new girl named Mirka might have taken her top spot in her absence. Like all of Andrea's books, this is a really thoughtfully composed story that really gives its young character space to grapple with complex ideas. In this case, things like disability, chronic pain, self-worth, how we conflate our own value with the things we do as opposed to the things we are. And even though it's not at all about romance or romantic relationships, Vale is definitely queer. Both books I'm recommending in this category also apply to the queer sports space because my last recommendation is B. Mullins Takes a Shot by Emily Diebert. This is a really fun, heartfelt, middle grade novel about B who just wants to survive middle school by sticking to the sidelines. But when the school gym is severely damaged and all PE classes are discontinued, the school strongly recommends that parents enroll their kids in some kind of after-school sport. Unfortunately for B, her best friend is determined to play for the school's first all-girls hockey team, and even though B has never played hockey or even set foot on the ice, she decides to give it a try. And the fact that the incredibly cool co-captain Gabby is also kind of cute doesn't hurt. This was actually one of the last books I read in 2025, and it became one of my favorite books of the year. Not only is it realistic in the sense that it doesn't romanticize or montage over the awkward experience of learning something new, but it also has a really great message about how you don't need to be great or even good at everything you try in order to find joy within it or to find some measure of success. So there you have it. Not counting the free space, that should be about 30 books you can check out for this next round of the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, or just enjoy any time of year you so choose. I hope this was helpful. I hope you found something new to add to your TBR. If you have any other reading plans or ideas for books that fit these prompts, feel free to share with the rest of the class down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye.